Hey guys, it's Casey. Alright, so there's a lot of reasons for the drug legalization argument, and I could go over all of them right now, but really there's only one thing I need to say to get my point across. So, first of all, what are we all aiming for with these prohibition laws and regulation and all that? We're looking to reduce harm, to reduce death, and to reduce addiction rates, right? So, when you look at harm as a way to measure how effective these laws are, then you can break it down pretty easily. So if you look at prohibition and you look at all of the deaths that are caused from the prohibition laws, basically what you'll quickly find is that legalization is has so many less deaths that it's simply just not worth making the drugs illegal. So let me explain. Basically, when a drug is illegal, what happens? The production, manufacture, the sale, and the distribution, it still continues. It doesn't stop because people are going to do it illegally anyway. And it will reduce the production, sale, manufacture, and trafficking and all that initially, but after about 10 years or so, it all goes back to normal eventually, and the rates don't decrease at all over time. It's actually been with prohibition with the alcohol, we saw that that's what occurred, and that's how it's gone with many other drugs. So, yeah, prohibition doesn't actually stop use or access at all, and in fact, in some ways, it can make it easier by the fact that, for example, in alcohol prohibition, rather than having a select few bars, they actually had a lot of different speakeasies is what they called them. And so in that way, it can actually increase access. But moving on to the point is that with prohibition, you have these drugs that are still being produced at the same rate, but they don't have any regulations or standards for their production and manufacture. So the chemists, the ones that are manufacturing these drugs illegally, they don't have any standards. They don't have to make the drug pure. They don't have to ensure that there are no impurities or that it's accurately measured and that the consumer knows what they are using and at what quantity. And so when they don't have those requirements, you can see why a lot of people would overdose without that information or knowledge. And, we're seeing it more and more today with how drugs are being laced and tainted with other substances. Now, in terms of lacing, in a DEA analysis, it was found that 42% of illegally manufactured pills contained at least 2 milligrams of fentanyl. All right, 2 milligrams of fentanyl is a lethal dose. So at least 42% of illegally manufactured pills contain at least a lethal dose of fentanyl. So just let that sink in for a second. And then you also have to take into account that not only are these drugs being laced, but the impurities can actually be more damaging than the drug itself. Take cocaine as an example. It was found back in 2010 that 80% of the United States cocaine has levomisole in it, this cancer treating drug that was discontinued in 2000 because it had some pretty severe side effects with causing the necrosis of flesh and this condition called granulocytosis, which basically causes a substantial drop in your white blood cell count. And when you have that happen, you can die from infection pretty easily, and it's a pretty serious condition that you don't want to have in combination with the necrosis of flesh. And so a lot of people, or not a lot, well, some people were getting this condition, and it's thought to be it was from an allergic reaction. But this is an example of something that is happening because these drugs aren't being regulated in a way that is allowing people to be safe and know what they're actually consuming. And the reason that these traffickers are thought to be lacing this cocaine with levomisole is because I guess it enhances the high a little bit, but it also, saves them some money. But yeah, they're not incentivized to be caring for the user. They don't care what happens to the user as long as they take care of the bottom line, and that's making the profit they want. So when you realize that the drugs that are consumed illegally, they're actually far more risky and far more dangerous, you can see why the overdose rates are just so substantially terrible when a drug is prohibited. And that doesn't even take into account the violence that occurs between drug traffickers and the deaths that occur from it, or the deaths that occur during the enforcement of these laws, or the deaths that occur, in prisons. Yeah, in prisons from the drug traffickers that end up going to prison and dying there. And so when you look at all these ways in which society is harmed from these prohibition laws, and the fact that just the overdoses, over 5 times as many overdoses occur when a drug is illegal with the opiates because of just the impurities and the lacing of fentanyl. It makes the drug over 5 times more as likely to result in an overdose. And we don't have treatments that reduce addiction or overdose deaths 5-fold. That's not something we're capable of doing. And so the only thing we can do is to have these drugs be regulated and accessible so that people can use them safely and ensure that they don't die. Because nothing else that we do is going to stop people from dying 5-fold. That's such a dramatic amount of people that are dying for something that just doesn't even have to occur. And that's just one part of just one tiny part of the problem. There's so many more negative ways in which prohibition is affecting all of us. It affects everybody in squandered taxpayer money and, the costs of the healthcare system that come from all that drug regulation. Pharmaceutical drugs, they wouldn't be so goddamn expensive if we didn't have as much regulation. And that's not to say that regulation isn't important, because we do need these regulations to ensure that these drugs are of quality and of a certain standard. But when it comes to preventing people from accessing those drugs, that's a whole different story. That is what allows for a black market to exist, an underground market where drug traffickers, cartels, and all of those criminal organizations can exist. So yeah, that's really what I wanted to point out, is that the amount of deaths and the harm that occurs from prohibition is just so dramatic that legalizing, it's simply just a marginally better solution just by that one standard. And nothing that you do in prohibition can reduce the death rate by that much. And by the way, decriminalization is a form of prohibition because the drugs are still prohibited. With decriminalization, it doesn't help much. It does make the drug users feel more safe and they don't have to fear prosecution as much when seeking treatment, but it doesn't even legally protect the users necessarily. Because in New York, for example, they would still shake people down for marijuana, and they would say that they were planning to distribute, or whatever you call it, because they had marijuana on them. So decriminalization doesn't even necessarily protect the user. Really, the only thing we can do is legalize these drugs, make sure that they're regulated, safe, and that people can access them and use them as responsibly and safely as possible. But that's really all I wanted to get across. That was the main point here. Thank you, and have a great day.